Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the show that digs into those big cultural moments. You know, the ones that seem simple on the surface, but actually hide these really complex layers underneath.
Yeah, like today, we're looking at that whole Sydney Sweeney situation.
Exactly. It started with, an actress, some jeans.
An American Eagle ad, yeah, and a pun.
Right, a pun. But the sources we've got access to, the analysis, the media tracking, the political commentary, they paint a picture of something much bigger, like textbook ideological conflict.
Definitely. It goes way beyond just fashion or a clever tagline. The sources frame it as this window into how ideological enforcement works today. And maybe, just maybe, how resistance to it is starting.
Absolutely. Our material really lays it out. The ad, the immediate, furious backlash, and then this really intense magazine interview that followed. The sources see it all as a coordinated push for compliance.
And Sweeney's reaction is positioned as, well, kind of a big deal, a refusal to play the game.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We need to unpack how this whole thing started with that wordplay.
Right, the good genes versus good.
Then we'll dig into the sources' take on that GQ interview, how they saw it as this engineered moment to force an apology.
Or a disavowal, yeah. And finally, we'll explore the bigger picture stuff the sources connect to, like this idea of longevity, culture wars.
Grudge that never dies.
Pretty much. And also how celebrity alignments might be shifting, or at least how our source.
Okay, let's get into it. Part 1. Where did this all begin? It really was about the words, wasn't it?
Yeah, it starts right there. The American Eagle campaign featuring Sydney. The analysis we looked at really focused on the marketing concept. It was a summer thing, and the tagline, the big finish, was Sydney Sweeney has great J-E.
But everyone knew what they were implying, right? The sources are pretty clear that GENES was the intended subtext.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't subtle. The source material points to specific parts of the campaign where they actually made that link. They talked about traits like hair color, personality, even eye color.
Being determined by her genes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing that breakdown. They really spelled it out.
Exactly. And the analysis suggests this wasn't just a throwaway line. It was a calculated marketing move. The sources argue the whole campaign was effective because it used Sweeney, someone conventionally attractive, known for, her looks, her acting, her whole vibe.
So the argument is they were consciously going back to that older style of marketing, the aspirational kind.
That's the core argument. Yeah, a return to an aspirational view. The idea being you see this attractive person wearing the jeans, you buy the jeans, you feel maybe a little bit closer to that level of attractiveness yourself.
And this is where the sources get really critical of what came before, right? They frame this as a direct reaction against campaigns that pushed, what do they call it? Obese models?
Yeah, that's the term used in the source material. They argue that the push towards body positivity, while maybe well-intentioned, had backfired for certain brands, especially brands built on being sexy or aspirational.
So the claim is that trying to be inclusive actually hurt their image.
That's the narrative thread. They argue it led to brands becoming associated with, their words, fat girl brand, and that this supposedly tanked sales and diluted the brand identity.
Okay, let's pause there for a sec. That's a pretty strong claim. What specific examples or evidence do the sources use to back up this idea that inclusivity strategies actually failed financially for these aspirational brands?
The main case study they lean on is Victoria's Secret. Famous for the angels, the big runway show, that whole hypersexualized image.
Right. They canceled the show, didn't they? And started using models with different body types.
Exactly. They moved away from that almost impossible ideal towards promoting body positivity. But the analysis we reviewed claims it just didn't work.
How so? What was the supposed negative impact?
The sources argue that by dropping the fantasy element, the idea that buying the lingerie let you tap into that supermodel dream, they lost their core. The argument is that the brand stopped being seen as purely sexy or aspirational.
And sales dropped.
The sources assert that sales took a major hit because the brand identity got muddled. Instead of aspirational, it became associated, in their view, with something less desirable in that specific market context. So bringing in Sydney Sweeney with that good genes pun is framed by the sources as a deliberate strategy to bring back that lost aspect. Buy her jeans, buy into feeling attractive.
Okay, that context is crucial. It sets up why the ad itself might have. But if it was just standard aspirational marketing, why the massive instant backlash? The sources pin this on the left. How do they make that specific?
They connect it to what they see as a broader cultural trend. The sources claim there's an ideological push arguing that just seeing conventionally attractive white women is somehow reinforce evil white supremacist beauty. That's the lead.
Wow. Okay, so the sources aren't just saying the pun was maybe insensitive. They're claiming the real reason for the outrage was specifically because Sweeney is white, blonde, and blue-eyed, and that this taps into some kind of open hatred for white people.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty extreme. How do they justify that analytically?
Their argument is basically, how else do you get from a simple clothing pun about jeans to accusations of it being a secret Nazi dog? They argue you need an underlying framework that's already hostile to traditional beauty norms, especially when embodied by a white woman.
So they're saying the critics weren't really upset about the pun itself, but used it as...
That's the interpretation in the source material. They focus on how critics immediately flagged her whiteness, her specific appearance, to frame the joke as being about genetic superiority.
The sources essentially see it as bad faith, that the critics deliberately misinterpreted the ad because the prevailing cultural narrative, according to these sources, favors ugly's beautiful or non-traditional looks, and is therefore automatically suspicious of conventional attraction.
Yeah, it's framed as a kind of preemptive policing. The sources argue the backlash wasn't really about the ad's content in the end. It was about using the ad as a tool, a lever, to force Sydney Sweeney herself into compliance, which sets the stage perfectly for what happened next with that GQ interview.
Right. So the ad controversy wasn't the end goal. It was just step one in this compliance test, as the sources see it. Let's move into that interview then.
Okay, this part is really interesting. The sources basically say this magazine interview, which should have been about promoting her new movie, Christie and Euphoria,
Right, standard promo stuff,
was completely hijacked. The purpose shifted from journalism to ideological enforcement.
Yeah, the analysis is really strong on this point. It suggests the interviewer had one primary goal. Force compliant. The sources talk about needling questions, trap questions.
Designed to get her to do what,
Right.
specifically? 3 things, according to 1, publicly condemn or disavow supported her, especially certain. 2, apologize for the ad. And 3, ultimately, just submit. To accept the premise that she'd done something wrong, what the sources call ideological subjugation.
And the very first question kind of set that tone, didn't it? Asking if she was surprised by the reaction to the ad.
Right. And her response, the sources loved, was apparently brilliant in its simplicity.
What did she say?
Just something like, I did a jean ad. I was like, what's the big deal? It completely sidestepped the implied guilt-earned prize, the question.
Didn't give them the emotional reaction they wanted. But they didn't stop there. The sources point out the quick shift to politics bringing up Donald Trump.
Yeah, the interviewer mentioned Trump had posted something on Truth Social about the ad, calling it a very crazy moment.
And the sources saw this as a deliberate tack.
Absolutely. The analysis reads it as a clear, if subtle, push. Get her on record distancing herself from Trump, from the evil orange man, as the sources often frame him. The underlying threat, they argue, was, if you don't denounce this support, you're tainted by association. You're worse by proxy.
And there's another layer here. The sources bring up this idea that Trump's support wasn't even genuine, but transaction. What's the evidence they present for that claim?
That's a really key detail in the reporting we reviewed. The analysis suggests Trump's team only put out that supportive statement after they found out she was a registered Republican.
Ah, okay.
So the sources argue the interviewer was leveraging this politically calculated support, this alleged transaction, to force her into an anti-Trump, whether she wanted to get political or not. It was basically trying to box her in.
So how did she handle that specific pressure point? Did she take the bait and disavow?
No, the sources really highlight her answer here as another she called the attention surreal. But then she immediately pivoted, said she was working insane hours, like 16-hour days filming Euphoria, wasn't even really looking at her phone, and crucially, wasn't thinking of it like that.
Sidestepped it completely by focusing on work.
Exactly. Didn't engage with the Trump aspect directly at all, kept it on her professionalism, refusing to be drawn into the political mudslinging. The analysis marks this as a key moment of non-apology.
Okay, so she dodged the political trap, but then the pressure ramped up again, didn't it? Moving towards her actual career, the boycott threat.
Right. The interviewer brought up the risk that, people might get some idea about her politics from all this and then decide not to see her movie, Christie.
Basically implying her career was now on the line because she hadn't played ball and apologized for the ad content.
That's how the sources read it. A direct attempt to link non-compliance with professional consequence. Are you really willing to risk your film's success over a silly jeans ad? That was the implicit question.
And this is the moment the sources really champion her response. They see it as a blueprint for handling cancel culture.
Her answer was incredibly firm. She said something like, if someone's closed off to a powerful story like Christie just because of something they read online, then she hopes something else opens their eyes later to art and learning. And then the killer line, she wouldn't be affected by that.
Wow. So not just refusing to apologize, but refusing to even be scared by the threat of a boycott. Putting her art above the mob mentality.
Precisely. It was a rejection of the entire premise that her career depended on pleasing these online critics.
So what was the final attempt? The sources say the interviewer tried one last really direct ideological purity test.
Yeah, they gave her an opportunity, quote unquote, to specifically address the criticism that white people shouldn't joke about genetic superiority, especially now. This is meant to be the moment she finally caved, explained herself, apologized.
The moment of submission.
Right. They handed her the framework genetics equals eugenics, basically, and just waited for her to agree. But she didn't. Her final refusal was, according to just perfect.
What was the final word?
First, just. The ad spoke for itself. Then when pushed again, she said, I think that when I have an issue that I want to speak about, people will hear.
Basically saying, I'll speak when I choose to about things I care about, not because you're trying to force me.
Exactly. The sources interpret this as her completely rejecting the idea that just because she's successful and fits conventional beauty standards, she's obligated to perform politically on demand.
And the analysis really emphasized her demeanor throughout this.
Right.
The polite, smiling refusal.
Yeah, they argued she handled it perfectly fine. She refused to backtrack or downgrade a successful campaign just because some people had an issue. And the sources claim that calmness, that smiling, polite fuck off, was way more effective, more diabolical even than getting angry or defend. It showed strength, not weak.
Okay, so she navigated the interview, refused to comply. But that brings us to the next major point in the source material. Just because you win the battle doesn't mean the war is over. This idea of eternal enforcement.
Right. This is where the analysis gets, well, pretty sobering. The sources put forward this thesis that in the long run, the left wing ends up winning culture wars, not necessarily through big upfront victories, but through sheer persistence, a commitment.
Meaning they just don't give up.
That's the core idea. The sources describe it as a system that never forgets and never ever lets a vendetta go unsettled. Even if someone seems to weather the initial storm, the pressure continues subtly or overtly for years, even decades.
With the ultimate goal being
to wear you down, to eventually enforce compliance, to make sure anyone who steps out of line eventually bends the knee, even if it takes a very long time.
And to make this abstract idea concrete, the sources use a very specific long-running example, Chick-fil-A.
Exactly. They use Chick-fil-A as the case study, the proof of concept for this long-term enforcement mechanism. And they argue it shows us what Sydney Sweeney might be facing down the road.
Okay, let's break down that Chick-fil-A example because it really does illustrate that longevity point. Where did it all start? The initial sin.
It goes back over 10 years to the Obama era. The issue wasn't commercial, it was ideological. The founders, the Cathy family, are known Christians, and it came out they had donated to groups campaigning against gay marriage.
Which back then sparked immediate outrage and boycotts from the left-right.
Huge boycotts, yeah. Very high profile. But critically, sources point out there was also a massive counter-boycott. People like Mike Huckabee organized Chick-fil-A appreciation days. Conservatives turned out in droves.
And at the time, that probably felt like a win for Chick-fil-A. Like they could stand by their values and still succeed.
It definitely looked like that to many. Sales went up, they showed resilience. But the sources argue that winning that early battle is irrelevant to the long-term mechanism. The proof is in the lasting grudge.
Okay, so how does that grudge manifest itself today, a decade later, long after the initial headlines faded?
This is the key. The source material claims that even now, left-wing legislators are still actively finding ways to penalize the company, not through consumer boycotts anymore, but through blocking their expansion using regulatory power.
Can you give some specific examples of those roadblocks mentioned in the sources?
Sure. The sources cite instances where city councils or state bodies, especially in more liberal areas, have denied Chick-fil-A permits to open in really valuable regions, like blocking them from opening restaurants at major highway rest stops.
Citing what? Values concerns.
Yeah, often vaguely citing values or inclusivity issues stemming from that decade-old controversy, or preventing them from getting spots in airports. Huge revenue.
And the sources make a point that this continues even though Chick-fil-A has actually changed its donation policy since then. They started giving to some LGBTQ plus supportive groups, right?
That's central to the analysis. The sources argue the targeting persists despite those core because, under eternal enforcement, the original sin is never forgiven. That initial slight during the Obama years becomes a permanent justification for punishment. It's what the sources call a purity spiral. It's never enough. It's never over.
Wow, that really does demonstrate a sustained decade-long effort. Quite chilling, actually. And the sources are drawing a direct line from that Chick-fil-A saga to Sydney Sweeney.
They see her situation as being in the very early stages of the same process. The prediction is blunt. She'll be hearing about this jeans ad in 10 years.
How? Through what means?
Subtle digs and reviews mentioning her controversial past, interview questions that bring it up unexpectedly years from now, maybe fewer opportunities for certain kinds of roles. It's about constant low-level pressure designed to wear you down.
And the sources ultimately think it will work, that she'll eventually cave.
They express skepticism about her ability to hold out indefinitely. The analysis suggests this rigid ideological enforcement works on most people over time. The prediction is she might eventually become more left-wing publicly, maybe start talking about politics in a way that aligns with the established. They use Taylor Swift as an example of someone they see as having made that kind of public shift.
And the reasoning behind that prediction? Why do they think the pressure will eventually succeed?
It comes down to perceived power imbalance. The analysis argues that the right wing, as they define it, lacks the institutional power in media, Hollywood, academia to provide sustained support against that kind of relentless establishment pressure. They believe the system is set up to eventually force compliance through career attrition, regardless of her current defiance.
Okay, so that's the grim long-term picture, according to this. But her immediate refusal is still seen as significant, right? As potentially signaling a shift in how public figures handle these situations now.
Oh, absolutely. The sources celebrate her defiance. They call it absolute cinema. Specifically, how she handled that GQ interview, the polite smile, the firm refusal is seen as proof that the era of apologizing to the mob is over.
And it's the way she did it that they find so effective.
Yes, that polite fuck off, as they term it, is considered more potent, more diabolical than getting angry or defensive. It projects control and dismisses the premise of the attack without escalating emotion.
And the sources see this as part of a bigger trend, not just her, but other public figures pushing back against what they call the woke mob.
Yeah, they argue this mentality of just saying fuck off and refusing to cave is gaining ground. It's a stark contrast to, the past few years where it felt like every celebrity was issuing apologies constantly.
To back this up, they point to other celebrities who seem to be shifting alignment, right? Nicki Minaj is a big example they use.
A huge example. The sources claim she has followed the Trump train.
That's a massive change for her public image. What specific event or issue do the sources say triggered this apparent shift in Minaj's case? It wasn't just general politics, was it?
No, it was quite specific, according to the reporting. It followed Trump making a statement about the persecution of Christians in Nigeria, something the sources note doesn't get much mainstream attention. Minaj then publicly thanked, saying she was grateful that God has re-entered the mainstream conversation and that someone was taking the issue seriously.
Liz, the sources read that as more than just a political endorsement, like a personal moral realignment.
Exactly. They see it as her breaking away from the kind of liberal feminist image she previously had and aligning with figures willing to discuss religious persecution and, well, God more openly.
Interesting. It suggests some celebrities feel certain topics like faith or traditional values are being pushed out of the mainstream, and they're willing to shift politically to engage with them. They also mentioned Kanye West, right?
Right.
Though maybe in a different way.
Yeah. Kanye comes up regarding his efforts to make amends for past The sources detail his meeting with Rabbi Pinto, his statements about taking accountability, and linking some past behavior to his
And Nicki Minaj supported that too.
Yeah, she publicly praised him for taking accountability and standing with our Jewish brothers. The sources contrast Kanye taking responsibility for genuinely offensive remarks versus Sydney Sweeney refusing to apologize for simply being in an ad or being attracted. It adds nuance. The defiance isn't about refusing all accountability, but specifically rejecting ideology. And this leads the source analysis into a really bold claim about how the culture itself has shifted.
This is the part about beauty standards becoming political.
Exactly. The sources argue that the cultural left has pushed its aesthetic ideology, the idea that conventional beauty is inherently problematic so far that it's actually flipped the script.
Okay, let's make sure we get this right for the listener. The claim is, because criticizing conventional attractiveness has become so common, simply being conventionally attractive, or saying attractive people are attractive, has now become a kind of right-wing position by default.
That's the core of it, yeah. They argue that when the cultural gatekeepers constantly label traditional attractiveness as problematic, like they claim happened with Sweeney's ad, it automatically pushes things like beauty, fitness, looking successful into an anti-establishment. And that camp, in their view, is now aligned with the right.
So the sources are basically asking, is being fit and good-looking now inherently right-wing? And their answer is yes.
An enthusiast. They argue that if you fit traditional standards of attractiveness and success, the current cultural powers are fundamentally hostile to you, making those very traits symbols of resistance.
And the flip side?
The flip side, according to the sources, is that if you are using their blunt language and ugly schlorb that hates yourself, then the current leftist cultural framework embraces and validates that, telling you it's okay, even good, reinforcing the idea that traditional beauty is the real problem.
It's a pretty stark framing.
Yeah.
Essentially, they're saying the attack on Sweeney's good genes inadvertently created this cultural space where conventional success and attractiveness became linked with refusing to apologize, a stance they label right-wing or anti-establishment.
And that ties into their final takeaway on dealing with cancel culture. The advice is blunt. The effective response is fuck off, never cave. The sources believe this approach, demonstrated by Sweeney, is finally gaining traction and has the potential to break the cycle of ideological enforcement.
They really see her handling of that interview, refusing to disavow Trump, refusing to apologize for the pun, refusing to debate genetic superiority as a watershed moment.
A crucial signal, yeah. A message to others that you can fail the compliance test and survive, maybe even thrive.
And that the way she did it calmly, politely, is the key.
That's the analysis.
Yeah.
That diabolical, non-emotional effectiveness. It signals a potential turning point, moving away from fear and submission towards defiance and professionalism.
Well, this deep dive certainly shows how a simple ad can explode into a major cultural battleground, exposing these deep fault lines about ideology, control, and resist. #outrare.
So let's try and synthesize what the sources told us today. We started with this Sydney Sweeney controversy, which the material frames as a perfect example of how relentless ideological enforcement works over the long haul.
Right. That Chick-fil-A analogy really drove home the longevity point, the idea that these attacks don't just stop, they're designed to wear you down over years.
Yeah, that internal grudge mechanism. But then the sources also highlighted this counter trend, the rise of what they see as an unapologetic resistance.
Embodied by Sydney Sweeney's refusal to apologize or get drawn into the political game. That smiling, polite shutdown. And they link this to other celebs seemingly realigning themselves politically.
So the core tension we're left with from the sources is this: attrition versus defiance. On one side, you have this system that supposedly never forgets, never forgive, always applying pressure to enforce conformity.
And on the other, you have this emerging strategy of just refusing, politely but firmly saying no.
Which leads us to the final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We saw Sydney Sweeney successfully navigate this intense pressure, this compliance test, with a smile and a refusal to engage. Was that a genuine break in the system? Is polite defiance actually enough to win in the long run?
Or is the Chick-fil-A story the more likely predictor? Will she, years from now, still be dealing with the fallout from this good genes, add subtle career roadblocks, lingering media narratives, constant low-level pressure? Because the system of eternal enforcement simply outlasts individual acts of defiance.
Is the polite fuck off strong enough to beat a decade-long grudge? Or does the enforcement mechanism just wait patiently for its moment? That's the big question the sources leave hanging.